Gray, and it's my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of our Religious Center initiative to this discussion with Jack Calhoun on his book, Hope Matters, The Untold Story of How Faith Works in America. I'm glad you came to join us in person. We're also broadcasting this live on over the internet, and it'll be up on the tape of it will be up on our website this afternoon as well. For the past several years, Jack has been on a cross-country quest to discover how faith motivates Americans, hardworking public servants and others. And he selected a number of individuals, 24 I believe, who have very interesting stories. Maybe some of you have read the book. It's available for sale outside if not, who have developed a variety of ambitious and innovative plans to make a difference in their communities. And I found a lot of their stories and accomplishments very moving and very inspirational. And as we look here at New America at how people are crossing different boundaries to help solve problems, I found his work particularly helpful. Jack reveals how people sustain their public work through their private spiritual belief and learn a bit about calling and about concepts which many faith traditions share in common. And in an age when religion too often is used to divide, I found some of his focus on some of the unity that religion has to be very helpful. I think the title of the book is very appropriate for our speaker today, because as I've talked to Jack and gotten voicemails or emails, this guy has just a very hopeful attitude towards life. And so Hope Matters, I think, is an appropriate title for our discussion. John Calhoun has had a distinguished career in several sectors. You may know him as the U.S. Commissioner of the Administration of Children, Youth, and Families, or as the Commissioner of the Department of Youth Service in the state of Massachusetts, or as founder of the National Crime Prevention Council. He lectures throughout the world on a variety of subjects, and we're grateful that he could join us today to talk about his book and really to dialogue with you folks here in Q&A around a variety of subjects. So help me welcome Jack Calhoun.
Thank you, David. It's really great to be here to see some old friends and some new faces, and I thought I'd share a bit about the book and then hear from you. I wrote it for three reasons. The first is really to describe the public face of faith that's not divisive, angry, or that even can trigger violence. Second, my story, because running into some of these people reawakened or sort of ripped the barnacle off faith, which got me started in this in the first place many, many years ago. To show you how ancient I am, it was before the Great Society programs. And the third is spotlighting the stories of amazing people grounded in faith, but who don't beat people up with their faith. And we don't hear these stories. We hear of Terry Schiavo, we hear of 10 Commandments in the courthouses or no, schools petitioning the right to pray, use of God in the Pledge of Allegiance, etc., etc. Religion can separate, hurt, even kill. Crusades, 30 Years War, Shiite, Sunni, recently Hindu-Christian antipathy in India. You may recall the words of the London bomber. The neighbor of the London bomber was asked, what was he like? And she said, oh, I noticed he was becoming increasingly religious. Religion then is tantamount to violence. And of course, the press is replete with it. Just a couple of quick examples. The Economist last November, 18-page articles about the new wars of religion, not a hint about its service or reconciliative dimension. The God Delusion by Richard Hawkins. And up there at the top of the bestseller list, God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything. I try to tell the story in this book of really the opposite, the story not heard, embodied in the lives of people who are doing the complete opposite. A faith that reconciles, not divides, alleviates pain, not causes it, serves, not dominates. Whether Christian, Jew, Muslim, it is a faith that feeds the hungry, brings hope to the poor, angry, visits the prisoner. William Coffin in his book Credo said something absolutely beautiful that I love. Certainly religions are different. Still, most seek to fulfill the same function. That is, they strive to convert people from self-preoccupation to the wholehearted giving of oneself. To love God by loving neighbor is an impulse equally at the heart of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. Therefore, it makes eminent sense in today's fractured world for religious people to move from truth claiming to the function that truth plays. And during the tsunami, this sort of microcosm of this debate, you had Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell asserting that the tidal wave was punishment for AIDS and our sins, whereas Bob Egner, head of the National Council of Churches, said, I really don't know what God had in mind. All I know is watch my feet. And he went to the victims of the tsunami. So that was one spur. The second spur was my personal story, but before I got really caught up in policy work, I was a young seminarian, very, very much involved in the civil rights movement, and I'll just read from the book one example. I worked at the Church of the Advocate in North Philadelphia. It's a pretty rough area, and it was a summer camp, and it was also the center of political action, SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, CORE. And we got a call one night from a hysterical Friends Service Committee worker who was calling a hot water heater had been overturned. A black family was integrating a blue-collar town, Folsom, just south of Philadelphia, north of Chester. The lawn had been drenched with gasoline, car was torched, and people were surrounding the house. And the couple, as I say, was huddled in a basement. We got the call. I read from the book. What could we do? What did we have? Not much. Ourselves, our bodies, a little madness. Certainly that we had to respond. Hardly thinking, I grabbed a large cross and a handful of choir robes and yelled for volunteers. As I recall, there were about 7 of us, mainly 8. We were a pretty motley bunch, mostly in our early 20s, a few young assistant counselors, some still in high school. We sped to Folsom, parked a few blocks from the address. We could hear the muffled yelling. It sounded like a football game. We donned our red robes and white cassocks in the steaming mid-Atlantic summer heat. One incident, it's Garland Dempsey, who was the driver, was totally in love with this beautiful young black woman who was very courageous, and he dropped to her knees, and his knees, and grabbed her and said, you can't go, they will kill you. And civil rights workers had died. I led, holding the cross high. I had no plan except to start singing, which we did as soon as we rounded the corner and saw the mob. What we saw seemed like an apparition, roughly 100 people who were in the street in the arc in front of the house. Many were women in curlers holding the hands of their children. Surely enough, 3 or 4 policemen sat calmly on their horses. A car, presumably the new owners, sat blackened in the street, sitting on cinder blocks. Stones littered the yard. Nigger go home was probably the mildest shout we heard. We started to sing. The feeling of unreality became mutual. The crowd stopped shouting and gaped at this ragtag bunch, slowly parting so we could get through. We sang our way up a small hill over the lawn. It grew so quiet that I could hear the crunch of the charred grass under our feet. We stopped in front of the house and kept singing. What could we do? Eventually, we were going to run out of songs. After a few minutes, it seemed to dawn on the crowd that they weren't facing a juggernaut. The silence broke. That's when somebody had the bright idea of throwing rocks not at us, but over our heads, onto the roof where the stones would roll down and hit our heads and shoulders. We moved a few feet away from the eaves, kept singing, but now we were clear of the rocks, but unfortunately closer to the crowd. Standoff might have lasted only a few minutes, but it felt like a day. The situation shifted abruptly when someone started throwing rocks against the house much harder. We felt them ricocheting onto our backs. Sometimes they shattered, showering us with pieces of rock. Strange, I don't remember being scared. I was consumed by another worry. I have 2 junior counselors in this march, no more than 16. If they get hurt, I will feel their parents' wrath. Anyway, it broke up. The state police came in. A local DJ had been notified. I visited the young couple the next day. We stood together amidst broken glass and splintered wood on the windowless second story, staring at the blackened lawn and the remains of their car. I'll never forget what the man said. He said, "It's hate," he whispered, "but hate hurts them. They throw rocks at themselves. It makes me sad." That experience, fueled by Martin Luther King and his inspiration, was kind of buried until I met Maddie Lawson. She and I served on the board of the California Wellness Foundation. We were at dinner. I had not met her, and I said, "Maddie, how did you happen to come on the board?" She said, "I lost 2 kids to gang violence, but now I have 400 kids. No other kid in my neighborhood will die." And that really snatched me back, making me realize that public policy doesn't get us up in the morning. Our core beliefs do. I was a father of 2. I can not imagine a more horrible pain. And it made me really reflect on what got me started, and Martin Luther King, whose work ushered in these tectonic shifts in this country's history, the Head Start, Job Corps, Voting Rights Acts, but he didn't begin there. He began with a passionate moral commitment, a view of the promised land, escape from slavery, unheard of, madness. And his framework was exodus, escape. What sustained him? His followers were harassed, beaten, sometimes even killed. He confronted massive structural injustice, segregated restaurants, schools being hosed, beaten, et cetera, with the only resources he had: his body, his determination, and his faith. And he refused to meet hate with hate. Just a few weeks ago, I met John Lewis at a meeting, a congressman from Georgia, and he said this: "If it were not for my faith, I wouldn't be standing before you. We needed to get up from our praying and move our feet. Without my faith, I would have given up." And I don't know whether you remember that Norman Rockwell portrait of that young girl, Ruby Bridges. Mm-hmm. Isn't that gorgeous? With tomatoes splattered all around her, surrounded by federal marshals. And she integrated a school, and everybody left. She was the only one being taught. She was 6 years old. And she basically said, "Oh, it wasn't that hard given everything that God's done for me." So in a way, it was Maddie that triggered it, and thinking very, very strongly of those folks that I'd met in my work. I'm doing a lot of work really in the community, seeing how people are committed and what keeps them going. Now, I have to say that a lot of these people, a friend just showed up, good to see you, don't proselytize. I don't know whether you remember that wonderful story about a rabbi and a priest and a Pentecostal minister who said, they were all chaplains. And they said that, we're really not doing the good work, the hard work, because it's kind of easy on the college campus. So if we were really good at proselytizing, we would go out and try and convert a bear. So I said, okay, and we'll meet in a hospital in a week. So the priest, Father Brennan, he had a broken arm, and he had a cast on his leg. And he said, well, it wasn't too hard, and I started to read the Bear Catechism. And he didn't like that, and he went after me, and I sprinkled holy water on him, and it just totally convinced him. And Holy Mother of God, he became as gentle as a lamb, and the bishop's coming out next week to give him confirmation. Billy Bob, the Pentecostal, said, we don't do that holy water stuff. We believe in the Word. And I gave that bear the Word. Well, he didn't like it at first. He wrestled me up the creek, up the hill, down the hill. We wound up in a creek. I dunked him, baptized him, and he came up praising. They turned to the rabbi, who had both legs in casts, both arms in a cast, and IVs, and he looked up and he said, I knew I shouldn't have started with circumcision. So these folks do not proselytize. As Tony Ortiz in the book said, if people don't like me or what I do, they're not going to like my God. I interviewed these folks, and the themes that were derived were Imago Dei, a spark of the divine in each of us, freeing the Mandela in you, service, naming and claiming, your pain can heal others, and a few others, joy and service, forgiveness, etc. Now, I just want to reflect on the hunt for this glossary, how it began. I served on Janet Reno's Coordinating Council on Juvenile Justice. And as was her wont, she would hold these meetings in the community. And just to listen and learn. She was terrific at that. And we were in the meeting in Southwest, and a minister was describing what his church was doing to help with the youth situation in crime and violence. And he talked about Head Start, he talked about mentoring, he talked about after-school programs, and then he got up, and almost parenthetically as he was leaving, he said, we get to go out into the community to get to know the kids by name. Well, I almost fell off the chair, and I said something. Underneath the bravado of so many kids is a profound loneliness. Their almost primordial need to belong. I remember when I was Commissioner of Youth Services, a juvenile murderer said to me, Commissioner, I'd rather be wanted for murder than not wanted at all. How basic to be called by name. Parental, we name our kids. It's love, it's protection. The God of Genesis, Isaiah. Israel, fear not, for I've redeemed thee. I've called thee by name, thou art mine, which I think is gorgeous theology and gorgeous social policy. Erin Jacoba drove this point home for me when I was my retirement ceremony. Erin spoke. She's little, she's tough, she's served time in the Indiana Girls School. We had structured a program called Youth as Resources, where kids spot social issues about which they're concerned, and if funded, they run them. And we started this with kids who volunteered. Would this work with kids in tough shape? Our first experimental program with kids who were locked up, and it takes a lot to be locked up in Indiana as a young woman, was with the Indiana Girls School. Erin was with the first group. Her project was to work with kids institutionalized with severe cerebral palsy. And she said, at my retirement ceremony, she turned to me and just said, Jack, when I came into the institution to work with the kids, they would fling out their arms and welcome me. It's the first time anybody had ever called my name positively. And when you think about it, where has her name been? I thought, truancy list, stubborn children list, delinquency list, police dockets, etc. And how many kids are out there, anomic, without name? Who claims them? Our church had a baptism 3 or 4 weeks ago. Paul was welcomed as a child of God at the altar, and this may be true in your traditions. The minister came down the center of the aisle and said, welcome Paul to the community. Then that marvelous welcoming ceremony, the bar and bar mitzvah later in life, and for Christians it's the confirmation, which is a little more tepid version. I wish it could have some of the singing and dancing of the bar mitzvah. And the Islamic tradition of the akikah, the naming ceremony. If we don't name our kids and claim them, who will? The Davids and the Jacks and the Angelas become named by gangs. Ratman, Needle, Lookout, Hawkeye. I was on a ride-along in Oakland 2 months ago with 2 guys who'd done time who are now working with kids on the street late at night. The giving back, and these guys had been vetted and they were doing good work, and we were doing a little trash talk. I was saying, do I have the right clothes for the street work? Man, you get the wrong threads. I told them what car I drove. You drive the wrong car. So I said, okay, what makes you guys so good? It was Billy Dupes and Jay Jimenez. It was about 11:30 at night, and we were in the mean streets of East Oakland. I said, okay, David's got his guys on the corner. There are 12 of them. They're tough. You get out of the car. What's your first word? What's your first sentence? He said something that I couldn't believe, and he just said it without a nanosecond's thought. He said, hey, loved one. I said, what? He said, hey, loved one, or hey, nephew. And you think about sort of the typology of gangs. They're called homeboys. So it's a language of home. It's a language of family. So he started off with, hey, loved one. I was keynoting a human service meeting in Massachusetts, human service providers meeting soon after that. And there are all the good folks doing the tough service, the counseling, the psychological work, the mentoring, et cetera, et cetera. But I challenged them. I said, where do we start? Do we start with, hey, dyslexic, hey, delinquent, hey, abused, or we start with, hey, loved one, let's work on that issue? So that's one of the chapters of the book, is this whole issue of naming and claiming and who's out there and what keeps these folks standing, dealing with some of the angriest and loneliest kids in the country. It's tough work. And as most of you well know, many of these people to whom you reach out are scared to death of relationships because they come from such a tangle of broken relationships. So don't let me fall in love with you, because you will disappoint me. So you can get spit at, you can get hurt, you can get hit. I'll just do a couple of others and then we'll open it up for conversation. Another is the issue of pain, the problem of pain, what to do with it. Joe Haynes is the DA in Brooklyn, probably the largest prosecutorial jurisdiction in the country. It's, I think, 26 stories of DA-dom. It's packed with programs: child abuse prevention, domestic violence prevention, mentor, and he won't hire you, even if you're Harvard Law, unless you agree to tutor a 4th grade kid. He just won't do it. What's under it? His father was a drunk and beat up his mother. His brother's a drunk, beats up his wife. And he said very simply, I was given this pain as an instrument of healing, so nobody would go through what I went through. And whether you interpreted that with that theological pain, nobody's untouched. Everybody's got some hurt, whether it's divorce or what's going on with a teenage son or daughter or whatever, parent with cancer. What do you do with it? So that's one of the issues. Tony Ortiz, who is in the book, was an ex-con and got converted and has been doing some of the most amazing work in California. He got the California Peace Prize 4 years ago. And he was also at the book's debut at the press club late last year, and just, he's one of the most amazing people I have ever met. And he says, give me the toughest. I want not the kid who's locked up, I want the kid in the hole. Tony feels that God's hand is on his shoulder. Look at my life. It was all preparation for this ministry and my work. So I look at situations, bad ones, especially bad ones, and I say, okay, God, what's your message? Why wouldn't I listen? What's my life? Weasel, that was his gang name. Nobody ever knew I existed except my jailers and a few homies. Most of them are dead. Now I'm speaking, training here and across country. I even went to the White House to talk about gang issues and attend the National Prayer Breakfast. So the issue of pain is one of the chapters. Another is forgiveness. Alexi Torres is a stunningly beautiful young woman from the Bronx, daughter of a custodian, and brilliant. And as she says, your life's mission, if you're smart, in the Bronx is to escape. And she did. Scholarship to Fordham, where I'll be speaking next Monday. And fast track on Madison Avenue, communications, and then work for the Rockefeller Foundation. She started to volunteer in Brooklyn and began to say, this isn't quite where I should be. She did a U-turn, and now she's working with tough youth in the Bronx. I had started a program in the Bronx. How do you stop crime and build community in places where people are too poor to move out? And one of the areas was in Mont Haven in the Bronx. Started it, and a year later I went back to see how it was doing. Well, the day I went back was after the Al Sharpton protest, the shooting of Amadou Diallo, the Ghanaian immigrant, remember that? 41 bullets. It was very hard to get to the Bronx because Sharpton had the city up in arms, or police barricades, or protests. So we had a hard time getting there. We got to Bronx High, where the meeting was. Met in the basement across from the boys' bathroom. It smelled, creaky wooden floors. And I went around the table because the whole thesis was key people in the community making commitments. So what were you, the school system, doing? What were you, the probation, doing? We got to Alexi, whom I'd not met. And she said, it's Lent. I thought, okay, it's Lent. And she said, I'm taking 41 kids over to do a service of reconciliation with the police, one for each bullet. And we all sort of swallowed very hard, and I said, aren't your friends and colleagues furious at you? They're in the streets probably. And she said, yes, but it's a time of reconciliation. So very strong dimension here of forgiveness. Another, and I'll do two more, and then we'll open it up, is the whole issue of Imago Dei. Hi, Emily. How are you? The really firm belief that there's a spark of the divine in all of us. It's framed in different ways. To Abdel, who's a Muslim, his metaphor is gold and iron. I quote from him. People are like minerals. In every person there's something good. Sometimes the bad outweighs the good. But we all have gold in us as well as iron. In each of us the proportion is different. We're so eager to know only the negative. Only the negative. We don't see the good. Instead of seeing the criminal, my faith teaches me to see the beautiful. It's too hard to change what's around you. You first must change yourself, your heart. All children are born as believers, but different things can happen to them depending on where and how they grow up. To the Baha'i, that framing is noble, and Marie Meredith is in the book. She said our mission is to dig out, to believe first that there is noble in all of us, and to elicit it. Alexi, on the mean streets of the Bronx, said this: I was loved unconditionally. My son is loved unconditionally. Most of the kids here aren't. Their parents weren't and their grandparents weren't. There is a long line of brokenness. She describes seeing men on the street who scare her, whose defensiveness, anger, and even hate she senses. She prays, asking God to help her see beyond the brokenness to the child in them, the child that once was whole, the child made in the image of God. And I've got a quote from Father Boyle, who works with kids in Los Angeles, Homeboy Industries, and he tells the story of Beto, a frequent visitor to his mission who was killed or shot. Father Boyle, all kids in this neighborhood know that when you hear gunfire, you run, you hide behind a dumpster. Beto froze, he took one in the side. An extremely large bullet entered one side and exited the other. The sheer size of the bullet rendered him paralyzed. Beto went through 7 hours of surgery. In the last hour of his life, I remember looking through the window, watching 7 or so nurses and doctors pounding on his heart, massaging his heart, begging his heart to cooperate, but it couldn't do it. Here's the truth. Beto was 12 years old, and he was exactly what God had in mind, but when God made him. But this is equally true and the hard one. I'm still quoting Father Boyle. Kids in that van, kids I know, were also exactly what God had in mind when he created them, but they didn't know it. They did not have enough people in their lives to hold a mirror up to say, here's who you are, and it is good, so the kids could inhabit that truth. Finally, just a vignette about purpose, what gets you out of bed in the morning. Doubling back to my opening theme of Martin Luther King and belief, one's personal credo preceding policy. Earl Pasinger is deputy chief of the Los Angeles Police Department. I met Earl in his office, where he was then serving as chief of the South Bureau, one of 4 deputies. Reputedly one of the most violent pieces of real estate in the country. Sun was setting, the sun glinted off his medals, and also on this board, this cork board in back of him, it bristled with pins. I said, what are those pins, Earl? And he said, oh, one for each homicide. And I cracked, oh, you're paying for your sins here? You've been sent to Siberia for something you did? And he rose up with his crisp uniform. He's a guy, you could feel there's ozone generating from it. Just, here's what he said. What I'm doing cannot compare to what he did for me, but what I'm doing is right. With the bill paid, Earl is free to serve. That's another thing about these people. There's a paradox. They work so hard, and yet they feel free. One of them, I digress, I know, is now the city manager in Columbia, who was police chief and who wore faith on his sleeve, and the city council brought him up and said, look, we love you, you're terrific, but you can't wear your faith on your sleeve. We got Jews, we got Muslims, we got atheists, we got everybody. Cut it out. And he said very simply, without any hostility, he said, you can fire me, but I don't work for you. And so it was, so there's this curious sense of freedom within the harness that these folks have. And his comment was not free to preserve his authority, but freedom to serve. Back to Earl. Even in the maelstrom that is South Central Los Angeles, he reflected only gratitude. Look, I've been given a huge amount. I'm now quoting. I've been given a huge amount. Look what he gave me. Look what others have given me. 5 generations ago, my people were slaves. They sweated in the field. The baton was passed through the years. Some ran with no shoes and no food. My daddy ran in sneakers on a cinder track. I ran in college with spiked shoes on a smooth track. Because of them, I will pass the baton. My sons are waiting. I will not trip. I will not fall. I will not be discouraged. I will not be stopped. If I have to pick up the community myself, I will do it. The Mormon term, and there's a Mormon in here, the term for finding purpose is blessing. The Greeks had a very different understanding of blessing, and David is the theologian here and certainly knows more about this than I do. But the Greek notion was blessing is if you were up there, you could frolic with the gods on Olympus. You could just go up and have a good time. The Hebrew Christian view is your blessing is to be found on the path, in the dirt. It's not separation. It's engagement. It's passionate engagement. That's where you find it. A quote from Alexi Torres again. With nonprofits and service, there are 2 realities. One is to give to charity. The other is to have solidarity with the poor. Not to think I will save them, but to believe they can save me. It's not a journey to the depths, she continues, but a journey to a rich and expanding horizon. People might say, Alexi, you've wasted your time, you've wasted your college education, but they don't know I'm at the heights. I've followed my bliss. Now, purpose for everyone might not be the big epiphany or the big calling, small c, or small or large v, a vocation. At the end of the book debut at the press club, a photographer who's a friend, Laura Pearson, came up in tears. She's a very good photographer, but she does a lot of the swishy stuff, dogs, weddings, poodles, and McLean and Potomac. And there's tears streaming down her face. She said, I've wasted my life. All I've done is take these pictures of frou-frous. And I said, and she said, I've hidden behind a lens because I'm shy. And I said, look, your gift as a photographer, why don't you think of using some of that gift to do some photojournalism at the shelter or the Boys and Girls Club and just use that gift? And she is volunteering in Philadelphia. Just a faith and politics note, because part of the agenda here is to wrestle through that. I believe that the voice of faith has got to be heard passionately in the public square. It's got to, not captured by it. God is not, contrary to public opinion, a Republican or a Democrat, or even gulp, an American. As the columnist E.J. Dionne writes, it's the role of people of faith to be skeptical, to question those in power on behalf of the voiceless. The voice of faith raises doubt about the certainty of certain policies. Faith grounds us, connects us, underneath the inevitable compromises. It was Lincoln who reminded us that both sides read the Bible. Recall also that the faith community ushered in tectonic shifts in this country: abolition of slavery, women's suffrage, civil rights, which triggered Medicaid, Medicare, et cetera, and the writings of the Catholic bishops in the early part of the last century really were the basis for the New Deal. The faith voice may influence the political, but it doesn't begin there. Were Christ, Gandhi, and Martin Luther King political figures alone, they would have been footnotes in history, I maintain. Christ is a Jewish revolutionary. Gandhi is forgotten as his colleagues. Who remembers the British governor or the Muslim leader during that time? And King is forgotten as the leaders of CORE or SNCC or the other civil rights activist groups. I wrote an editorial for the Post about this a few years back, and I'll just close with, I was going to close with Isaiah, but on my lap, but anyway. It's faith and funding simplified, and on this issue of the faith voice in the public square in policy, my typology was threefold. One was faith-drenched, Colson, etc. Those folks, for the most part, don't want Caesar's coin. They want to do what they're doing, and the core of the work, Colson's prison ministry, is faith. So don't give me any government restrictions. The other is what I call faith-linked. And when I was Commissioner of Youth Services in Massachusetts, over half of my providers had faith in the name. Baptist Children's Home, Catholic Charities, Jewish Children Family Services. Nobody complained, and Massachusetts is a very litigious state. And the welfare department, the mental health department, my department, youth services, well over half were contracted to those with faith in the name. I think the middle ground is the tough ground. That's faith-based programs that offer services, but also offer things like prayer, like involvement in prayer, and have a staff of very often faith-based folks. I think of the Children's Trust Initiative here in D.C. at Lincoln Heights, working with some of the most broken people and families in this city. And they offer services, family services, budgeting, tutoring, etc. But they pray every day, mainly to keep themselves going. John Bess, who runs a program out of St. John the Divine in New York, Malmoud, the rector there, he was an atheist at the time and said, "You guys are in Harlem, you're taking over our turf, you owe us room." So they gave John the basement. And I don't know whether the organ music or whatever filtered through, but John got converted. And in addition to his stuff with youth, fairly typical work, mentoring, tutoring, job training, work habits, he had what he called a grace circle once a week. It was voluntary. It was very, very interesting. The grace circle would basically say to folks, so-and-so's going through stuff, let's pray for him, let's pray for his mind. It was very, very personal and very direct, and it was optional. He said, I had dropouts from all the other programs, but nobody dropped out from that one. I had almost 100% attention because of the intimacy. So as I wound up with this editorial, let me be clear, these programs, need to meet the same rules as other nonprofits. Their work must not be taken on faith, but at results, and they can't proselytize. Our at-risk kids staying out of school, addicts off drugs, parolees out of prison. But each of us must ask himself, would I be there for the troubled and the troubling, the juvenile returning from an institution? Can I endure the anger and pain? Can I live my faith, but not compel others to do so? There are precious few of us who can answer yes. For those who can, I say let them keep their faith as they go about the public good.
Very good. Jack, thank you very, very much. I'll take the prerogative to ask the first question and then open it up here. I appreciated in the book, as with much of your life, there seems to be both a walk of the public and the private, the direct and the indirect service, that so much of your career is in trying to change the conditions of society, but also much of it comes out of the personal. And because you just closed focusing on the public square, and I was going to ask your opinion on some of those issues, frankly, as we wrestle here at New America, looking at the party platforms around the faith-based initiative and other things, to talk about the personal for a second, because I get a sense from the book that you make connections. So much of your writing and work comes out of the personal. And, you know, Jack and I just met 40 minutes ago, and we already have these different connections. It turns out I preached at the church he's a member of 3 weeks ago, and you may not know, but the associate pastor at the church where I was a pastor for the children's program has outlined your entire book and is using it as an instructional piece for the senior highs. And these connections seems to go through his whole life. So as you've gone through and done the journey of this particular book, how have you changed in terms of your view of America's, how faith is working on the ground or on the well-being of children, or your personal relationship in faith? Is there anything in you that has changed from the experience of writing this book?
Wow, that's a very, very strong question. I think from a policy point of view, it's affirmed the role of faith community in, I use the phrase, in changing this tectonic plates. I mean, it really reaffirmed what King did, the sacrifices he made, and that he would be indeed a footnote in history were it not connected with his faith. Second, also from a public policy point of view, doubling back to my speech in Massachusetts, I think a lot of our services, and folks around the table can come back at me because some of them I know are deeply involved in this work, we have not risked the intimate. We have not. And as a matter of fact, with the Freudian stuff, clinical distance is the watchword. As I went through this book, and also thinking of my career, running programs, designing programs, and working on public policy, it's very much be objective. Now, we need that objective stuff. On the other hand, people are dying for intimacy. As that young juvenile murderer said to me, I'd rather be wanted for murder than not wanted at all. And through this book, I realized some of the hardest work, if not the hardest work in the country, is being done by people who are risking relationship. And risking relationship with kids who are frightened to death of relationship, or individuals. So from two policy perspectives, one, the macro, who's pushing the environmental issue, who's pushing these new economic justice issues, who's out there, where's that voice of faith? But from the configuration of service delivery, who's risking a relationship? And that's tough stuff. I mean, it's even tough stuff who are allegedly normal, as we all know, whether it's marriage or relationship or whatever. I think for me, then, if I can presume to tease out that the third part of your question, I think my faith relationship is a little more personal than it was. Mine was very, very political. I guess a lot more framed in terms of the social justice work, and that's still there. I think as long as I can walk, I will have that. But I think the other piece is that you know, and I finally joined a church, as Emily knows, after, I don't know, 25, 28 years of kind of being in diaspora. So that need for a faith community, and so I think there's a difference there, if I've answered your question.
Very good, very good. All right, let's dialogue here. Any questions for Jack? If not, I'll just keep going.
Did some of you who work with kids or close to that resonate about this?
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you about.
The risk, the intimacy, come on, come back, or just validate it or whatever? Who has a thought about that? Angela, you were nodding.
Hey, I used to work with foster youth in San Francisco, and it just always, I mean, when you were talking about the home, like, gangs and these affiliations that youth have as being a place where they find home, I just think it's so true that a lot of our youth, especially, I really feel like foster youth, it's so easy for them to go into like gang affiliations and other places where they get called by their names, where they have a name.
Yep.
And that was one of the things that we really strive to do at the organization that I was with, was to create, you know, a family, like a safe place where they could always feel like they could go home. We had a lot of youth who would
That's
go
a lovely
AWOL,
phrase, where they could go home.
where they could go home, and our director, she was known by like almost the whole human services agency as like the mom, and these kids would come back and they would call her mom. She claimed me as one of her daughters, and she was so sad to have me leave. But you know, we would have kids who would go AWOL from their group homes, and they would come to our center, you know, and they knew that we were gonna have to let their group home staff know that, you know, they're not, they're actually over here. They knew that, but they felt so much more safe at our organization as opposed to the place where they were supposed to be at home. And did you find, like, what do you think is the difference between organizations? Like, what makes it different for youth from your experience who choose to go to one place over the other?
Well, I think you hit the difference. I mean, you can provide services, which is terrific, but I think the aid for relationship and this whole business of mom or daughter and the language of home, I really think the way and how we deliver social services has got to rethink. It really does. I mean, this whole sort of Freudian worship of the objective, it just really bothers me, especially for such broken kids. And maybe it's me. I mean, I like to hug people, okay? You know, that's frowned upon. But I just, this ache to be connected and to beyond being fixed. And I'm not saying being fixed is not wrong. I mean, if I've got dyslexia, I want to be fixed. But also, I want to be accepted, known, loved. So I think that's so much the inspiration of a lot of these. Some of them are doing quasi-social justice stuff, like the DA in Brooklyn, and all his programs. But a lot of this is really nose-to-nose intimacy based on some of these theological themes.
Interesting. Further questions for Jack? Oh, yeah.
Jack, I remember at one point, 10 or 12 years ago, you were involved in identifying the resiliency characteristics, tracking kids who were, what were those characteristics that enabled them to come out of situations and circumstances where most kids were not able to. I remember a skill set, an adult involved in their life in a consistent way, a community relationship. Can you talk about faith that fits into those, how faith fits into those characteristics?
That's a good question. Thanks, Gordy. Gordon and I worked together a great deal when I was head of the National Crime Prevention Council, helping with legislation. He's doing amazing work with other nonprofits, including Big Brothers Big Sisters and others. Yeah, there were 4 or 5, if I can remember. The one is, and these are kids, looks like Gordy and I grew up tough. He made it, I didn't. Why? There's a lot of writing about that, but I tend to boil them down to 5. I think the Search Institute has 40. One is an adult who's always there, no matter what existential tornado hits. 2 is a skill I can point to. I can shoot hoops, I can play the violin, run a meeting. Optimism, either defined in a secular way, I've got hope, or I'm held in his hand. Both dimensions, both theological. Another, interestingly, is altruism, that it's not just me, but I'm there for somebody else. I don't remember the 5th.
to the community. I have an obligation or I
Yeah.
have a role and a responsibility.
Sort of the extension of the altruistic thing, but, yeah, it's a lovely bunch of literature looking at kids. This kid should not be making it. There's no way, and yet they are making it. And so those, there is a fifth one, but I can't remember it. But those are really basically it. The Isaiah piece, I just wanted to say that I quoted was, to me, just such a lovely combination of the social justice. I got to read this because I just love it, so you have to tolerate me. To me, it's brilliant social policy, brilliant theology, and brilliant psychology. He talks about Isaiah 58. It's so New York. It's so New York Jewish. I mean, he's saying, you think this is what I call fasting, just because you lash yourselves? I mean, you think this is what I call worship, and then you shortchange your worker? You think this is what I call it, and then you beat up your wife? And he goes on, and it's so funny, and that's so wonderful. And he said, didn't I tell you that this is what you're supposed to do? Obviously, it's my paraphrase, now I'm quoting. To untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free, to break every yoke, to share your food with the hungry, to provide the poor wanderer with shelter, when you see the naked, to clothe him. And then the next sentence just blows me away. It just stuns me. So he's got this social justice piece, an obligation. And then he says, your light will break forth like the dawn, and your healing will appear. He's not talking about the beneficiaries, the naked who are clothed. He's talking about you. And then he goes on to the same sort of rap. And then he says, and you will be like the noonday sun or the wellspring that never dries. So, and then he goes on to conclude about you will rebuild the, and I quote it because it's such a combination of the social justice and the personal. I think his last sentences are, we will rebuild the ancient ruins, raise up the age-old foundations, will be called the repairer of broken walls and the restorer of the streets with dwellings. So,
Powerful stuff. Any final question? If not, I want to thank folks for coming today, and thank those who are watching live on the net, and please join me in thanking Jack Calhoun for being here.